Great to be here, and what a wonderful conference it's been, and thank you to the organisers for the wonderful hospitality in Sapporo. And I'm here to talk about some epidemiology and thinking about the herd, regional level and international level issues. So, when giving a keynote presentation, two principles: be provocative, come up with some crazy ideas, and number two, look to the future. So that's what I'm hoping to do with this talk. And as a first comment, cattle production medicine, I suppose out of all the veterinary disciplines, has a really long and successful history of using epidemiology to identify and correct problems in the herds that we work with. And in our part of the world, in Australia and New Zealand, a man that we'd give a great deal of credit for that process would be Doug Blood. And I would call Doug Blood veterinary science's answer to William Osler. He was a great clinician, but not only a great clinician, thought very carefully and deeply about population level issues and joined the two together, and that was a real strength of Doug's work. And if you go into any veterinary practice, I'm sure in Australia and New Zealand and possibly elsewhere, you're sure to find one of Doug's books, Veterinary Medicine, sitting on the shelf. And in fact, if you want to age a veterinarian, get approximate age for a veterinarian, you just look at the edition of Blood and Henderson on their shelf. Yep. So, and Doug worked at the University of Melbourne, so we build on strong shoulders. In the 1970s, some really key work out of Doug and the group that was working at Melbourne, including a couple of characters that we've worked with in New Zealand, Roger Morris and Norm Williamson. Norm's at the conference this week. Back in the 70s, they did this groundbreaking work on herd health, and a series of about 6 papers appeared in the Australian Veterinary Journal and really laid the groundwork for production medicine. And in the early 90s, I started practice as a veterinarian. Very quickly realised that my clinical skills were not so good, so I moved to the population level, and I spent a lot of time running around collecting this information from the books and typing it into a computer. The young people these days would never believe that we would do such a thing, and then used these early computer programs to analyse herd performance. And again, from the University of Melbourne, this is a retrospective mating analysis package that was put together by Mike Larkham. And this was fantastic because it allowed us for the first time to quantify herd performance. This is using dairy champ records. This is, I think, my first attempt at a graph using a computer, and looking at the relationship between heats detected and calving to conception intervals in a bunch of dairy herds that we were working with. So great historical value these old treasures. So thinking about sorting out herd problems, what's the process? Very well established process. Is performance below that which is expected? Okay, so we need to define a benchmark. That's step one. Can we identify subgroups of the herd that are experiencing this suboptimal performance? And then when we identify those subgroups, third step, we develop appropriate interventions. And then, most importantly, we monitor responses to those interventions and revise them if necessary. And so this is a very well established, and we've been doing it for a long time. And my purpose for putting these slides up is to say this is nothing new. We've been doing this for a long time. Here's another example. These were the sorts of reports that we generated in the early 90s, late 80s and early 90s. This is a conception rate problem in a dairy herd, so don't focus on the figures, just a lot of numbers, a lot of data, and measuring performance by time periods. And if I show this graphically, I have date on the horizontal axis here. On the vertical axis, I have first service conception rate. We've measured first service conception rates in this guy's herd. We can put some confidence intervals around those conception rates. We can set a target level, a benchmark, and very quickly I can see that we have a conception rate problem in this herd. Okay, one of the telltale signs for me is this bouncing up and down of performance, and that's a clear sign of a herd problem, these mad fluctuations in conception rate measures over time. So what was our next step? I knew that this guy used a bull, he didn't use artificial breeding, so one bull was used. We took the inter-estrus intervals for this herd. Now this is the target frequency histogram of inter-estrus intervals for dairy herds, and we compared our target with what we were seeing for this herd. And what you can see here is that we have a lot of long inter-estrus intervals, and inter-estrus intervals occurring at 25 to 38 days. So that, coupled with the poor conception rates, is telling me that this guy probably has an early embryonic loss problem. So we go back to our graph, a few questions. We talked about vibriosis in his bulls, and we decided to vaccinate the herd for vibriosis. And then the final stage of the problem-solving process was to monitor performance. And then over time, we tracked the first service conception rates, and we saw that not only did conception rates improve, but we're avoiding these fluctuations in first service conception rates for each 3-month period. And so that was a sign that we'd more or less solved the problem. So, as I say, probably many of you in the room will have similar stories to tell. Yeah? The process that we use are very well defined and have been carried out for a long, long time. Yeah? And as clinicians, I'm proposing that really we need to think beyond the farm gate. And when we move up from the herd level to the national level to the international level, the principles that we are using to solve problems are exactly the same as that which we use at the herd level. And that's a key thing to remember. But there's a problem when we're doing that. Often, people working at the regional and the national level have very poor data on which to base their decision making on. And that's a key problem, and this impedes good decision making. A second problem, just thinking about this earlier during the week, is that often the people making decisions at the regional and national level haven't worked as clinicians. And that's an issue as well. They haven't been through that process of working with an international herd and then sorting a problem out and then getting the confidence that epidemiology, tracking numbers, recording things carefully, reporting on performance, developing an intervention, monitoring progress can be done. So those two things are impeding the progress at which we're making good decisions at both the national and the international level. So what's the solution for that? Well, number one, we need clinicians to move into government roles. And then number two, we need better data. And what I'm proposing is that we need to have a seamless transmission of data from the herd level up to the national level, and then even beyond that up to the international level. And if we have a good, strong foundation of data at the herd level, that can be used for good decision making at higher levels. So, what I'm getting at is cloud computing. Dorothy Dopfer, I think in her keynote speech yesterday, talked about this issue. So these are, there's rumbling in the jungle. These concepts, these terms veterinary science, we need to make use of them. So why do we have to do this at the national and the international level? Well, that's an easy question. BSE in the late 1980s, dioxins in Belgium, and more recently in Belgium, E. coli, food safety scares in the USA and numerous other countries, and the list goes on and on and on, and emerging conditions that we have to deal with regularly. In Japan, BSE, particularly in Hokkaido, huge problems, not only internationally, but nationally, and consumer confidence is impaired. And this title to this caption here is "McDonald's in Japan gives out free burgers to fight fears of mad cow." And that, in some ways, is very reminiscent of this picture of John Gummo feeding his child a hamburger in the early 90s. Okay, so these are important issues. So that's my background. Now I'll quickly go through the issues around problem solving and then wrap up with some take-home messages. At the individual herd level, I've already outlined the process for solving problems at the individual herd level, and already well established are the methodologies for calculating benchmarks for dairy and beef herd performance. And this has been done for many years. And as herd production improves or really changes over time, we need to be prepared to adjust those benchmarks. Okay, so we read textbooks, we read a target conception rate, target calving to conception interval, all of these different figures, and we need to move away that this is figures that are hammered in stone, and that they need to be revised. And a nice example of this, just recently from New Zealand, and Chris Compton in the audience here has just finished a very good PhD on dairy cow reproductive performance in New Zealand over many years. And here Chris has quantified the risk of being sold, the risk of death, and the risk of being culled for dairy cows from 1990 through to about 2015, and tracked these figures over time. And this work came out of questions that were being asked that death rates in dairy cows were increasing. And so the purpose of Chris's investigation was to determine if death rates in New Zealand dairy cows were increasing. And the conclusion from that work was, if they are, it's a very, very subtle increase. Okay, and so for that reason, there was no need to revise the benchmark targets for the risk of death in New Zealand dairy cows. I hope I've got that story right, Chris. Yep. Okay, so that's at the national level, adjusting benchmarks. Also, we can adjust benchmarks at the individual herd level. And just quickly, I've really been doing my history here. Some great work, again, from the University of Melbourne from the early 1990s. Pauline Breitling came up with a very nice way of adjusting targets, submission rates, conception rates, and in-calf rate targets in dairy herds on the basis of oestrus detection efficiency for an individual herd. So the idea here, again using these frequency histograms of inter-oestrus intervals to quantify oestrus detection accuracy and intensity, and when you have those two measures, you can revise your target conception rate accordingly, because there's no reason to expect a perfect or a high conception rate in a herd where oestrus detection is poor. And I think for the time this was fairly novel work, and that's something dairy residents we need to bring this work into the 21st century. Okay, at the national level, countries that export animals and animal product need to be aware of the risk of emerging diseases and to develop systems to allow emerging diseases to be detected promptly. And the USA, in recent times there have been cases of BSE, and in response to those detected cases, a huge level of interest both internationally and nationally on the US Department of Agriculture's efforts to respond to those detections. And really the consumers want confidence that their meat is safe, and the international community, particularly trading partners, want that same reassurance. And countries that export animals and animal product need to be aware of the risk of emerging diseases. And how do we respond to these incursions quickly? Well, we need detailed information at the individual herd and sometimes at the individual animal level. And so this is directly analogous to the investigations that I made back in the early 1990s with sorting out the conception rates in my dairy herds. I enumerated my population, and that's the critical step number one. Define your population, measure the frequency of disease in your population, set your benchmarks. Is the frequency of disease above or below your benchmarks? Is there a problem? Apply your interventions and monitor your responses to your interventions. And if we do this, it makes it easier to document the extent of disease to our trading partners, and gives our trading partners and our stakeholders greater confidence that we're managing the problem appropriately, and basically that things are under control. And in New Zealand at the moment, there's an incursion of Mycoplasma bovis causing a great deal of concern. The consumers are not so much concerned about this. The international trading partners are not so concerned about Mycoplasma bovis, but the farmers themselves are concerned. And so again, this need for the government, the Ministry for Primary Industries, to provide stakeholders, and in this situation, stakeholders are the farmers themselves. There is a huge need for the government to be showing their stakeholders that they have things under control. And so a huge amount of information, community briefings telling farmers about what's being done and how the process is being managed. Okay, so we have three groups that we need to manage: the farmers themselves, the consumers, and the international community. So there's a lot on our shoulders. China, if we move to China. Earlier this month, African swine fever was detected in China. I'm not aware of the Chinese, what's happening in the media in China at the moment, but I imagine amongst the pork producers, it's big news. The international community is looking very anxiously on China to be sure that African swine fever is being managed appropriately and the outbreak can be extinguished quickly. So you don't have to wait long to find good examples in this area. They're always happening. Yeah. So, as I said, key thing, if we're going to sort problems out, we need to enumerate our populations. That's our first step. And this has been happening for quite some time in the dairy industry. Good work has been carried out in New Zealand, Australia, and the Nordic countries on providing facilities to record disease events in dairy cows. And these are just some shots. We have apps available in New Zealand and Australia to record individual animal disease events, and we can report on those figures. And as I say, the Nordic countries have done a lot of good work in this area. And this is the sort of information we need to inform surveillance. And believe it or not, similar facilities are now starting to pop up for other domestic animal species. And so in New Zealand, a program has been set up for equine medicine, recording disease events in equine medicine. And in Australia, in companion animals, there's a program called Vet Compass, where practices in Australia sign up to the Vet Compass program and contribute information on the patients that they see each day and the disorders that are identified in companion animals that come into these, if you like, these sentinel or surveillance practices. And this is a map showing the distribution of Vet Compass practices throughout Australia. And already a pretty good system. Each of the universities is given a breed to deal with. University of Melbourne has been given Labradors, and so we have the complete data set for Labradors that have been monitored throughout Australia. And here's an example of the data that we have. Age of the dog on the horizontal axis. Every time a dog comes into the clinic, the dog gets weighed, and so we have body weight, and now we can track, we're establishing benchmarks. We know what the normal weight for a Labrador should be for a given age. Okay, and so when our patient comes in, we can weigh and see where our animal fits according to this benchmark. So the principles of what I talked about earlier are exactly the same. Okay, what do we need if we're going to use these systems? Well, we need clear case definitions, particularly if we're talking about disease. So here I've talked about body weights, that's pretty easy. We weigh the dog, record the weight. But if we're talking about disease, we need to, the veterinarian needs to make a judgment about what clinical condition the animal has. So we need clear case definitions. And secondly, when we analyse the data, we need to interpret it appropriately, and we need to develop expertise in doing that. And thirdly, once we've gone through that whole process, critical is that we feed our information back to our stakeholders, so the stakeholders can see the value in providing that information in the first place. It's impossible to expect 100% diagnostic accuracy with these systems, and this is a very common thing that occurs in meetings. People complain, we don't have a precise diagnosis. We shouldn't be doing this. It's useless. I would say that the benefit of these systems comes from detecting changes in what I would call a previously stable disease profile. So it's more the change that is of importance rather than the precise diagnosis, because we simply, for different reasons, we can't expect every veterinarian in the country to make an accurate diagnosis. And thinking about this changes in a previously stable disease profile, we need to address issues of system sensitivity and specificity. So is the system sensitive enough to detect a problem if there is one? And is it specific enough? Do we have too many false alarms? So it's a trade-off between having a system that's either too sensitive or too specific. And we need to develop expertise in working with the data to get that balance right. So now I'll talk about a case study, a national level, sorting out a national level disease problem in New Zealand, and this one's a story about acute salmonellosis in dairy herds. And sitting in the audience here is Kevin Lawrence. I think I got these photos from you, Kevin. Throughout the country, since about 2008, there was a talk of herds experiencing outbreaks of salmonellosis, and so these are herds that would be sent out from the evening milking with no problems, and then when the farmer brought these animals in, the herd in for milking, and the next day many would have diarrhoea, sudden drop of milk, and some were recumbent and with I don't know if you can see that there, but a blood-stained diarrhoea. And I think these are Kevin Lawrence's. Kevin Lawrence, there we go, yep. Okay. All right, so we actually had pressure from the practitioners that there was a problem. And we went through the process. In fact, we did a case control study. The practitioners identified, they had their hypotheses about what they thought were risk factors, and in doing this study, we tested those hypotheses. This was the data that we had from the Ministry for Primary Industries. Now, this wasn't individual herd data. This is what I would call secondary data. These were laboratory submissions. So the Ministry for Primary Industries pays the laboratories each year to report on laboratory submissions for different disorders. And so this is the information that we were using to objectively detect that we had a problem. Okay, and what we've got here, date on the horizontal axis, going from 2004 up to 2012. On the vertical axis, we have the number of salmonella isolates from the laboratories. And what we see is we have a very strong seasonal fluctuation in salmonella isolates, and that's because of the seasonal pattern of calving in New Zealand. But since about 2008, what we're seeing is higher numbers of cases in these intervening periods. See the difference here? We've got high, well, the amplitude of these peaks is greater, but also we're seeing a greater number of cases in the intervening periods between the seasonal peaks. And this was telling us that probably from 2008 onwards, we have a change in a previously stable disease profile, and that alerted us that we had a problem that we should investigate. So we did the case control study. We implemented some interventions in January 2012, and that was to remove the sale of a mineral supplement. And then what was the next step? We've implemented the intervention, textbook case, problem solving. Next step, monitor interventions. So we went back to our labs and we said, hey guys, don't change anything. Yeah, don't go changing the way you're reporting your laboratory submissions. We want to see what happens the next year. And then bingo, over the next year we've got a substantial drop in the number of cases. And that is giving all of us confidence that what we've done was appropriate. Okay, now it's not rocket science. It is just so simple. So simple, simple, simple. Yeah, what did we have? We had the population enumerated. We've gone through each of the steps, established a case definition, came up with some hypotheses, tested the hypotheses, fed it back to the stakeholders. The stakeholders responded by removing the food supplement from sale, and then we watched to see what happened, and bingo, it worked. All right, let's now move to the international level. So the question is, if we've got good information at the individual herd level, why on earth can't we aggregate this up to the international level? And I'll come back to the examples that I've talked about, African swine fever, and the situation in China at the moment is a complete replay of what's happening in Europe. Yeah. So 2007 in Europe, we had, I think it was Georgia, an incursion detection of African swine fever, and over the period of about 10 years, African swine fever, some of the Europeans in the room will be able to tell us more about this, has marched its way westward into Europe. Okay, so a difficult problem to solve. I look at the maps that are being produced and I see some problems. Yeah. Why on earth, now the blue dots are wild boar in 2016. Yeah. Why on earth in Estonia and Lithuania and Latvia have we so many wild boar cases reported? Does that mean that there's a hell of a lot of wild boar in Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia? Probably no more wild boar than what's in Russia and Ukraine, but there's a clear difference in reporting of cases. So we've got countries with different capabilities in their ability to report disease events. And my goodness, how on earth can we expect to control such a devastating disease when we're in this situation? It's impossible. Yeah. So step number one is very, very simple. We need to enumerate the population at risk. Yeah. Okay, African swine fever in China, 2018. Hope that we're not having a complete replay of what's happening in Europe. Okay, that's my concern. And right at this very point in time, it's the last day of August 2018. This is the first month of detection. Now is the time that we need to be hitting African swine fever hard, and as hard as we possibly can. We don't wait 5-10 years to start scratching our heads and saying, oh, well, maybe now we should start doing something. Now is the time. But if we're going to hit it hard, we need to know where our population at risk is. And then we need to apply the same principles that we as clinical veterinarians have applied at the individual herd level. And it's as simple as that. And it's attention to detail. Okay, I'll now move to foot and mouth disease. Again, this is data collected by FAO and OIE, and we have foot and mouth disease reports for different countries, and for the period 2009 to 2013. And again, I'm looking at these maps, and I'm making inferences. Okay, so number one, what's the pattern of disease, and number two, do we have any problems? So I look at Vietnam to start with. And what concerns me here with Vietnam is we seem to be doing a pretty good job recording cases in the lower mid part of the country. But what concerns me, what's going on in this midsection? Okay, when I see these abrupt changes in point locations, that tells me there's a problem. Okay, if I go back to the map of Lithuania, Estonia, we've got this border problem. Okay, and that tells me that we haven't got the information that we need. So that's issues that need to be addressed. Have a look at Cambodia. This is not looking too bad. It looks like we've got a port of entry here. This is like the Venturi effect, I think, where FMD is being blown through a border crossing. But I wonder what's going on up here. Move on to Thailand. Thailand's been doing a pretty good job with their vaccination campaigns. Probably reasonable that we should expect this sporadic pattern with Thailand. Okay, so again, differences within a country in reporting, differences between countries in reporting. We've got to tidy that up, and that's got to be done better. And we can't expect to eradicate foot and mouth disease unless we have good information on which to base our decision making. Okay, so the take-home messages, well, for me, what I've talked about makes logical sense. To me, it's a no-brainer, yeah? We do have the technical solutions in terms of data capture, data validation, data storage, data analysis. And again, I refer to Doherty's keynote presentation yesterday. The technology exists to solve this problem. We do have some issues with the different countries around the world. This is a shot from a colleague, Charlie El-Haj, from Melbourne Uni, who's just come back from Mongolia. Mongolia, we have nomadic farmers. So this is a special problem in that our farmers don't remain stationary, they move. So we have to develop some special systems for special countries. Okay. The other thing in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, production of poultry is very small scale, ubiquitous, and movement of poultry to market by any means is very, very common and extremely difficult to enumerate a population at risk in these circumstances. But if I come back, we're at the World Buiatrics Conference. Okay, cattle are easy, they are big, they are easy to enumerate. So can we not start with, pick the low-hanging fruit first, get the cattle sorted out, and when we have some successes with cattle, then we move on to these guys that are more difficult. Okay, veterinary science. We have done some amazing, amazing work at solving some tough problems. Mad cow disease in 1986, after 300 cases of BSE had been identified. John Wildsmith had used a case control study to identify that meat and bone meal was the vehicle of transmission. There are a total of about 190,000 cases of BSE in the UK for the period 1986 to 2015. Okay, for several years running now, the UK has not reported a case of BSE. What a triumph. Veterinary science, this is amazing. Okay, I said Doug Blood was veterinary science's answer to William Osler. John Wildsmith is veterinary science's answer to John Snow. Yeah, to me, it doesn't get any better than that. And what a huge problem, it could have been for human health in terms of variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Okay, so we've solved some tough problems. Again, FAO and the OIE have done amazing work with avian influenza, all right? A lot more technical issues. Had they prevented a pandemic? We'll never know. It's a counterfactual argument. Okay, but some amazing work dealing with avian influenza. The problem is, with a tough disease like avian influenza, where the population is not well defined and we have tremendous movement of animals, there are a lot more technical issues and a lot more uncertainty. It was pretty easy with BSE. Okay, we had a country full of English people that followed the rules and recorded good information, and problems could be solved quickly. More difficult with bird flu. Okay, so to wrap up, accurate information allows good decisions to be made in times of crisis, but our biggest obstacle is, are our producers willing to share information about their herds? And going back to Joe Brownlee's keynote presentation earlier in the week, there's a need for veterinary leadership. I think with emerging animal diseases, the key principle is that we need to know where our populations at risk are, and when we have that in place, then we can move forward and solve problems. Now, it's not that we haven't been solving problems previously, but it's taken a long time to effectively solve the problems. By setting these systems up that I'm talking about, we can do them more quickly. Okay, so I think moving forward, we've got to really push for tackling these issues, greater consistency across countries in terms of knowing where our populations at risk are. And as veterinarians, we are the key people to lead this. So on that note, I thank Rata Hidano for the translations, and any questions?